Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining. This is our regular time to have our New Hampshire Network's Climate Working Group meeting. Um, but I'm doing a special presentation that I delivered first at Citizens Climate Lobby's Northeast Regional Conference last month. Um, Wanted to share it with New Hampshire and get it on the New Hampshire Network's events page. Thanks for joining. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the growing U.S. carbon price gap. There's actually three gaps I'll be talking about. I'm going to start off by establishing that there's a growing carbon price target required for a relatively safe climate future. Review global carbon pricing progress. Carbon pricing is spreading, prices are rising, and CBAMs are coming. Talk about the source of the headwinds in the US that has delayed putting a price on climate pollution. Share carbon fee and dividend resources and some ways to communicate the policy with others. Share ideas and call for policy-focused climate action, and share some of my heroes and inspire some heroism. Thanks so much for joining. This presentation is available at bit.ly/carbon price gap presentation. The link is on this page and it will be on the last page. Okay, so this is my daughter and I winter hiking in New Hampshire, exploring and enjoying nature and the natural world with my daughter, as my parents did with me when I was growing up. It, it's one of the reasons that a stable climate matters very much to me. We're going to talk about helping create political will tonight. Helping create political will for a livable world is an expression of love. Marshall Saunders was CCL's founder. He used to say that what we are doing is for all of life. And I believe that's true. There's also a big economic and jobs opportunity that we may be letting slip away. Who will lead in the 21st century? Well, for the last century, the US invested in and led the major transitions, from automobiles, nuclear, and space to computers, the internet, and smartphones. We got the job and economic benefits of leading those major transitions of human civilization in progress. And the clean energy transition is next, the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy solutions. Those who use the most powerful and cost-effective policies will lead it and enjoy the first mover advantages for decades to come. So just a note about the problem. We do have a pollution problem. There's scientific consensus about this. Um, there are 200 scientific organizations that agree about the scientific basis, and there are none that I know of that dispute it. And I've been making this claim for 10 years, and nobody has been able to name one uh, that disputes this consensus conclusion based on all the available evidence. But there's also economic consensus that many people are less familiar with. I'm going to read the first statement of 5 in the Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends, which is the largest public statement of economists in history about anything. And they say, a carbon tax offers the most effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. By correcting a well-known market failure, a carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards a low-carbon future. In fact, carbon pricing is required if we want to achieve our important climate goals. Former Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said in her confirmation hearing, we cannot solve the climate crisis without effective carbon pricing. In its special report of global warming on 1.5 degrees, the IPCC stated, explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. And the World Bank says carbon pricing is a critical part of the policy mix needed to both meet the Paris Agreement goals and support low emissions growth. Okay, so what is the US carbon price gap? Actually, there's two US carbon price gaps and one global carbon price gap. And I'll explain them with this one graph. On the left-hand side, the y-axis is carbon prices, dollars per ton of carbon dioxide emissions um, released into the air to become greenhouse gas pollution. And then there's years on the horizontal axis. The gray line is from the IPCC's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, where they gave years and price ranges required to hold warming to 1.5 degrees, in addition to other complementary policies. They say we have to be at least at some carbon price globally, plus uh, many other complementary policies, but those can be a mix. Um, One price target they specify is in 2030, the range is between $135 per ton of CO2 emitted and $6,050 per ton of CO2 emitted. Then it goes out to 2100. The price range for a 1.5 degrees future there is $690 per ton of CO2 to $30,000 per ton of CO2. And it's such a big range, there's a lot of uncertainties. It depends on the general economy. It depends on the variability of fossil fuel prices, but also there's some uncertainty in the science and the economics. Um, we just know that the price of carbon should be high and rising if we want to stay future. Okay, so the first gap is between the US price today and the price on that IPCC line today, their minimum price, which is about $90 per ton of CO2 compared to 0 tons of um, $0 per ton of CO2. The US price is zero. Um, that's the first gap, and it's steadily rising over time. The second gap is between the US price, the red line, and that of our trading partners. The green line is Canada. Canada had a price on both consumer and industrial carbon emissions. They just dropped the consumer price, but they still have the industrial price, which is responsible for 3 times the emissions reductions of the consumer price. Um, and they will be at $135 per ton in 2030. The blue line is the EU, and the EU's cap and trade, which specifies the amount of carbon that can be emitted by various sectors. Um, but those carbon credits are bought and sold in a market, which changes the price depending on um, economic and other factors. But they're also uh, in line with the IPCC's minimum price also. And then the third gap is between the global price and the IPCC's minimum price. The global price on carbon emissions is about $5 per ton of CO2 emitted from all fossil fuels. So that gap is also very large. Okay, so En-ROADS is a global climate policy simulator from MIT and Climate Interactive. I got 3 slides to show um, the difference between what we are headed toward now and where we want to be policy-wise. So, given the existing policies that are in place around the world, the model in En-ROADS shows this global sources of primary energy mix is likely, which will result in this um, greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, which will result in about 3.3 degrees Celsius global warming by 2100. But until a couple weeks ago, I used to say the carbon fee and dividend price, which starts at $15 per ton of CO2 and rises by $10 more per ton of CO2 a year, pushed around the world with a CBAM, which I'll explain later, and rising $10 more each year through 2100 is half the solution to meet our climate goals. It reduced the final temperature down to 2.4 degrees. Well, time is passing, and we weren't pricing carbon, so um, our carbon budget is shrinking faster than it would have been had we been following along that gray line of IPCC carbon price. And also, they updated their models. Um, Now, to get to that half of the solution um, scenario, you start at $65 per ton of CO2 the first year and rise by $15 per ton of CO2 each year afterwards until 2100. But it's still about half of the solution to global warming. And then once you've got a strong carbon price, you can add complementary policies like heavily incentivizing, subsidizing energy efficiency in transportation, buildings, and industry, work on carbon dioxide removal with nature-based solutions and some technology, um, addressing agricultural emissions, waste and leakage, and reducing or stopping deforestation. So it is still technically possible, and this is a well-regarded model, to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees, but this is assuming very significant policy changes globally right now. Okay, so it might seem a little grim about carbon pricing based on that, but it's actually not. Um, Carbon pricing is spreading, prices are rising, and CBAMs are coming. CBAMs are it's an abbreviation for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms. Um, that's how a country that is pricing carbon can charge its carbon price on imports from free polluting countries um, to make a level playing field in their own economies so that so that whether another country charges for carbon or not, um, they don't have a competitive advantage by letting their pollution be free. So this is a good thing to tell people, and it will be news to most people also. This picture of the country, of the world, shows the 75 countries and regions that are currently pricing carbon. Um, and uh, the EU will soon have a border carbon adjustment. And most of these prices that we're looking at are rising over time. This is from the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report that the World Bank produces every May. Um, this year's uh, report should be out by the end of this month. Some of the other interesting bits of information in it um, are the history of carbon pricing spreading. This is showing the percent of global fossil fuels that are covered under some carbon price. Um, in the last 15 years, the coverage is about quadrupled. Um, so carbon pricing is spreading, now covering almost a quarter of all fossil fuels sold in the world. And prices are rising. So there's two ways to price carbon. One is a carbon tax, and another is with cap and trade. Um, these are some of the carbon taxes that are in place. Um, Canada's carbon fee and dividend is shown they were increasing it by $10 per ton of CO2 until 2022. They raised the increment by $15 to $15 per year added to their price um, to get to the price where they want it to be. And then there's cap and trade, the other way to price carbon. Um, this, the amount of carbon emissions for a sector is determined that's allowable, and usually that is reduced over time by reducing the amount of carbon that can be emitted and setting up a market where polluters can buy and sell credits that allow them to emit those carbon emissions. It drives the price up and down depending on various things, but you can see these prices are rising for the most part also. However, most prices are still too low. This is some of the major countries that are using carbon tax or cap and trade. And from the World Bank, there's a 2-degree price range in light green, but there's also the 1.5 degrees carbon price range. According to the World Bank, um, their range starts at $226 in 2030, which is higher than the $135, of course, because we haven't been pricing carbon for the last several years across the world as the IPCC was modeling. In Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, two men wait for another man who never arrives. The play is an example of the 1950s theater of the absurd, which in Europe after World War II explored the emotions at the time of the absurdity of existence, the purposelessness of life, and how suffering increases with the passage of time. Is the rest of the world waiting for the US to praise carbon a modern case of the theater of the absurd? I don't think so. Waiting for a carbon price in the US could be the opposite of waiting for Godot. Citizen Climate Lobby's founder, Marshall Saunders, sometimes shared a favorite quote from Man and Superman by George Bernard Shaw that goes like this: "The true joy in life is to be used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. Our purpose, creating the political will for strong climate policies like federal carbon fee and dividend legislation, is indeed a mighty one." I think that negates the fundamental premise about life from Godot. The part about increasing suffering is happening right now from climate pollution, and it's why Marshall's vision and all of our efforts are so important. Less pollution means less suffering. We can make things better, and we will make things better. So let's take a look. Is carbon pricing possible in the US? Because the industrial, ideological, and political headwinds are very strong. They've been strong for decades. And right now, it doesn't look like we're very close to pricing carbon. But the US is now the only developed country in the world without a carbon price, and CBAMs are coming, which will increase the pressure. The EU CBAM starts next year in January. They'll be charging US exporters of energy intensive goods their carbon price when US goods enter the EU market. The UK will start the year after, and Japan the year after that. Australia, and Canada are also looking very closely at doing CBAMs as well. This is going to put strong pressure on US businesses, um, and they will put strong pressure on Congress to price carbon. And Canada did it. They did it with good policy and good messaging. And Canada is quite similar to the US in their media and the fact that they're a major fossil fuel producer. And one of my climate heroes is Greta Thunberg. And she said in her TED Talk, "Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope." So that's why I think focusing on carbon pricing and creating the political will to enable Congress to do that um, is such an important thing. It is difficult politically, but it is something that needs to be done. Okay, so let's talk about those four things in sections. The first is the headwinds, mainly from the fossil fuel industry, that have delayed the U.S. pricing carbon. It started 50 years ago, at least, but with a Powell memo written to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which Senator Whitehouse now calls the U.S. Chamber of Carbon, because of the money from the fossil fuel industry influencing what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does. And the Heritage Foundation. The Powell memo was a result among a few conservatives who, after uh, Earth Day in 1970 and the subsequent passage after 10% of America went out in protest of all the air and water pollution in the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the creation of the EPA, the industrial response was what can we do to pull back control from the public in addressing our pollution because it's affecting our profits. And this is a long-term strategy of taking over various parts of our government to pull back the influence that people have on the policies that are in place. Naima Reskus is a science historian professor at Harvard, wrote a really interesting book over a decade ago called Merchants of Doubt. It's also a movie now. on the ideological underpinnings of the effort to delay or block legislation to address human health or environmental problems by the fossil fuel industry, and some free market fundamentalists who believe the government should just stay out of the way of markets. Inside Climate News is a Pulitzer Prize awarded investigative journalist outfit. They wrote a multi-segment bunch of articles kind of under the headline of Exxon New, where they exposed the paper trail of Exxon's decision makers when they were warned by their own internal climate group that they had a pollution problem from their products. And they decided to, instead of working to help government address the problem, maximize short-term profits by delaying effective policies to address the problem. Robert Burrell did a study right after Citizens United to look at the money trail of money that had been clearly going from fossil fuel interests to front groups and politics to delay addressing the climate pollution. And he found that the same amounts of money that were going from the fossil fuel interests to the front groups continued to flow. But after Citizens United, an intermediary, a dark money group like Donors Trust, looked like it was becoming a way to kind of clean the money so that when it actually went to be used for ill purposes, it couldn't be traced back as easily to the origin. Frontline has a great three-part series called The Power of Oil, released a couple of years ago, about the whole history of the fossil fuel industry, its front groups, its manipulation in the public's understanding of climate change, and the politics and misleading of policies to address their pollution. And even more recently, Senator Whitehouse is still doing two YouTube series. These are actually Senate floor talks. One is called Time to Wake Up, where he talks about the science and the economics and policies of climate change and the costs to society today, and also the scheme, the corporate scheme to capture the Supreme Court and everything else to take control of what policies can be put in place by the billionaire families and fossil fuel interests that don't want us to address their pollution. There's a podcast called Outrage and Optimism, which has some leading global figures in climate that have been working for decades on this. I think one of the best ones is episode number 200, The Need for Science-Based Policy. Their guests include Naomi Oreskes and Senator Whitehouse, and they talk about the problem and the history of having attempted to address it. They get about an hour in, and they start talking about what really needs to be done. And one of them says, really, we just need to put a price on carbon. And then there's Al Gore's most recent TED Talk, What the Fossil Fuel Industry Doesn't Want You to Know, which dives deeply into what the fossil fuel industry has done to prevent us doing what we need to do. Okay, so I've got a couple short videos here. The first is from Keith McCoy. He was Exxon's top lobbyist, and this is a sting operation. He thought he was being interviewed for a job, probably for higher pay, at Saudi Arabia, and this is him kind of spilling the beans. He thought this was not going to be put on YouTube, but it did get put on YouTube. Him talking about what Exxon has been doing.
Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes, we were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders.
In this context, a shadow group is when you or someone you know sets up a separate group that you then fund to promote fake or misleading scientific conclusions that support your preferred conclusion. Shadow groups are basically how people catfished each other before Facebook. And Keith McCoy just admitted that Exxon used shadow groups to trick people into thinking climate change was fake so they could keep making their insane profits.
Yeah, so you kind of start wondering, what are we fighting? Are we fighting climate change or are we fighting the fossil fuel industry?
Carbon tax isn't going to happen, but it gives us a talking point that we can say, well, what is ExxonMobil for? Well, we're for a carbon tax.
The senior director of federal policy admits on camera that they only support a carbon tax because they know it won't pass and they can use their fake support of it as a talking point.
Oh my.
So how does Exxon know a carbon tax isn't going to happen? Well, they've been paying heavily for decades to make sure it won't happen. That's really the only reason. Uh, they think that they can keep um, diluting the political will that would be necessary to enable our government to do what is needed for our safety. Um, when I heard this video the first time or watched it, I thought, excellent, we finally got them. This is proof that what they're doing is bad, and we're going to be able to get them to stop. Unfortunately, some of the climate groups that we work with took this um, as just a given. Okay, carbon tax isn't going to happen, so we need to focus on other things. Um, but I would ask, is this a call to give up, or is it a call to action? There's a policy that we need to do for our own safety, and the only thing missing is the political will to do it. The fossil fuel industry has actually been playing a two-faced game with a good actor face and a bad actor face. I've written about this at bit.ly/two-faced game, but in summary, they say they accept the science of pollution from their products being the main driver of global warming and that being a problem and a very dangerous one and expensive. And they say they support carbon pricing because it's basically economics 101. But they also have been putting their money and attention into delaying that happening. They fund, there's 100 front groups that do their bidding. They pay PR firms, they control media and politics in the promotion of myths, half-truths, and lies to the public and legislators to delay the necessary legislation. Um, a main source of the money is kind of group of billionaires collectively known as the Koch network. It's the Koch brothers, Charles and David. David died several years ago, but Charles is still at it, and he has more brothers and more generations after him. Funding front groups, some of the main ones that we see are ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, Heartland Institute, the Heritage Foundation, which was key in the Project 2025 document and implementation. Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Institute, Young Americans for Liberty. There's a long list of these. And they're active at the state and national levels, state politics and national politics. And it's not just Congress. The Supreme Court has been basically manipulated to the point where they have control. The Federalist Society is one of these groups that the billionaires have kind of taken over. The last three Supreme Court justices appointed were all approved and put on that Federalist Society list. And there's billionaires behind it. And then there's the president. Trump's $1 billion campaign quid pro quo offer to big oil. Give me $1 billion for my campaign and you get whatever you want if I'm elected. So to take a look at two of those front groups real quickly. Heartland Institute says their mission is to discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to social and economic problems. But a little attention to the rest of what's on their homepage is more ways coal improves the economy and the environment. This is not what most scientific organizations or any scientific organization would agree with. Wind power is buying eagle kill indulgences. So these are the source of much of the media that is pushed out into society through various other outlets, but it originates in these front groups. They call it climate realism. The Associated Press is wrong. Coffee prices aren't rising due to climate change. Sorry, PBS, population growth and infrastructure, not climate change, are causing Rhode Island's water woes. None of these are supported by um, the scientific consensus. You can learn more about these front groups from various sources. dsmog.com is a really good one. They research the money trail, the funders of these organizations, and who the leaders are and what they do. Another group that impacts us in New Hampshire is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is kind of David Koch was on the presidential Libertarian ticket in 1980, ran in a bunch of things that were very unpopular, and the ticket ended up getting less than 1% of the nation's vote. They're still at it, though. This group is a reflection of the crazy ideas that he was talking about 45 years ago. Well, this one is the $5 trillion tax cut that the billionaires want. This would be terrible for our debt, but they're not so worried about that if they can get a tax break. Um, they would like to get rid of the Department of Education, the EPA, Social Security, a whole bunch of social services and science that we need for our safety and prosperity. Um, and this is how they kind of look at energy, investments in energy efficiency and clean energy. They call it, a costly government overreach. Um, but you can learn more about ALEC at DSMOG. And also, I wrote a web page called notnotter.org, and there's a special page just for ALEC. One of our state reps has gone to their conferences, fully paid for by this front group. ALEC reimburses for all the travel, food, lodging costs, and even recorded a video and put it on YouTube with her saying that she's happy to be part of the ALEC family. DSMOG also has this really interesting article that notes foundations linked to Koch gave at least $9.6 billion to 15 Project 2025 groups since 2020. Four of the lesser known families, Bradley, Scaife, Seed, and Uline, gave even more. And all six families' fortunes helped to fund Project 2025 groups that have denied science of man made climate change. So the picture in the web's page shows the six billionaire families and then some of the 100 front groups that the funding from those families is going. They don't do these things with their own names. They set up these really conservative, upright sounding groups with Liberty and Heartland and healthy sounding names, but really they're just shadow front groups that send the message that these billionaires have really taken over a lot of conservative thinking at this point, tricking conservatives into believing that these are legitimate conservative values. What they really have is they want to keep their pollution free, and that's the core of their objective. To do that, they paint a thin veneer of conservative values on top of that, calling it free market. But when pollution's free, you have market failure, according to economists, and a free, unrestrained market does not maximize the benefits for civilization, which is really the purpose of markets. We need some government control, which these billionaires are against. This is a picture taken in the Adirondacks. Actually, it's a painting of a picture of Justice Thomas hanging out with one of his billionaire friends, Harlan Crow. Um, Supreme Court has been taken over by what looks like an attempt to create a fossil fuel oligarchy. Okay, CCL provides some resources to defend against these dark arts. The first one is Dana Nuccitelli, one of the key authors of skepticalscience.com, a climate scientist's website to bust myths that are promoted by those front groups. Um, Citizens Climate Radio recently had an 8-part series called Hot Mess: How Climate Consensus Led to Political Chaos. Um, it covers the role of conservative media in spreading climate skepticism, the fear-based messaging and divisive protest strategies that they use to alienate potential allies instead of getting lots of groups to agree with each other that are trying to do something about climate. They end up kind of sometimes fighting each other. And by exploiting our emotional vulnerabilities, the fossil fuel industry delayed action and protected profits at our expense. Um, okay, but there's also some headwinds from the left. Um, so I just talked about the fossil fuel industry, but there's also some progressives have a distrust of capitalism. Um, might make sense if you agree that markets got us into this mess. But they're ignoring the foundational economics of the problem, which is if the pollution was free, the market actors would be incorporating it in all of the decisions being made by the market. So the problem really is they should distrust market failures and work to address them. And then there's some who have just capitulated, given up after years or decades of efforts to price carbon didn't yield results. Um, some progressive thought leaders now say it's either not possible or it's not equitable. Jesse Jenkins um, thinks carbon pricing is impossible, so we should be focused on other things. Leah Stokes is a political analyst saying, she believes that it's impossible, so we should be doing other things. Even Bill McKibben, who used to be a strong advocate of carbon pricing, now doesn't talk about that. He spends his his very strong following of people that are worried about climate, focusing on other things like divestment. Um, there's other entities in our society, like NPR, is very quiet about carbon fee and dividend and market failure. Clean Energy New Hampshire also it would be great to get an endorsement from them for carbon fee and dividend. So when we lobby Congress, we can show the members of Congress from New Hampshire we have business and industry support. And then there's New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, also quiet. If you have any connections with these groups, please let them know that you'd like them to support carbon fee and dividend, endorse it, and talk about it, and get their business members to endorse it and talk about it. Okay, so let's switch over to success for a little while. Catherine McKenna was in charge of the communications when they were talking about doing carbon fee and dividend in Canada and succeeded. She is now the United Nations Net Zero chairperson, and she was formerly the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change in Canada. And she says implementation details and messaging are critical. And what she liked to say about carbon fee and dividend is, we're making it no longer free to pollute, and you're getting more money back. And here she is.
If you start off looking at polling, the polling is terrible. If you say, do you want a carbon tax? Terrible, terrible, terrible. What about carbon pricing? A little bit better. What about putting a price on pollution? Better. No longer free to pollute. Best.
Whoops, I was supposed to be doing this. I was checking my notes. And she also says in that podcast, and you're getting more money back. And that makes it even more popular. According to studies, about 65% or so of the population is pretty much in favor of carbon fee and dividend right from the start. But if you explain the dividend makes them come out financially ahead each month, most likely about 2/3 of households break even or come out ahead. That makes it between 10 and 15% more popular. Okay, so Canada did just undo their consumer carbon price. Here's some lessons learned from Catherine McKenna. Don't hide the rebate. So when they first started the program, there was a annual line on the tax form that Canadians filled out that didn't really make the connection between the carbon fee that fossil fuel producers were paying and the rebate that consumers were getting. And then they changed it to a quarterly rebate, so it was coming through banks, but those banks um, were not labeling the money, the direct deposit or check money that people were getting to make it clear that the money was their carbon cashback rebate either. Um, and then we've learned that we really need to anticipate industry mischief. One of the provinces passed a law that gas stations had to put a sign on every gas pump about what the increase in gasoline cost was due to the carbon fee. It didn't say anything about the rebate. It didn't let people know they were probably coming out ahead. It just showed them the increased gasoline price. And they did a similar thing with heating oil prices, which got rolled back a little earlier. The fossil fuel industry marketed that the high cost of heating oil was due to the carbon fee, but in fact, that was a year that they had made more profits than ever before, and there was um, supply constraints due to Saudi Arabia and Russia. So they were just, they took hold of the narrative. Um, at the same time, Catherine McKenna left her place in Canada and went to work on the international level. And so her communication expertise left with her, and Canada really wasn't working to help people understand that they were coming out ahead. And really, if you stop messaging it, you cede control of the narrative, and the fossil fuel industry picked it up. So that before the last election, voters heard axe the tax, not it's no longer free to pollute and you're getting more money back. So the importance of political will for this policy doesn't stop after legislation. In CCL, we're always evaluating what needs to be done and what's the best thing to be doing for climate at the current point in time. Somebody asked on a forum, is it too late for carbon fee and dividend? Jonathan Marshall, who was the economist of CCL until last year, wrote in response, carbon pricing will always be the most potent measure for curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Dividends make carbon pricing fairer and politically more popular. And Dana Nuccitelli, who now works in CCL, said, there is no too late because a carbon price will always be effective at reducing climate pollution, and every fraction of avoided global warming matters. Remember that action is the antidote to despair. Every fraction of avoided warming matters, and it's never too late to improve our future world. And George Donnert, the state coordinator for CCL in Alaska, shared this quote from Marshall Saunders, CCL's founder. Constancy is my favorite virtue. So many people will go for a little while and get excited for a year or two, but it is really constancy that gets things done. So, right from the founder's words, we need to continue focusing on carbon fee and dividend and political will to make it happen. A quick list of some of CCL's carbon fee and dividend superpowers that you can use. We listen to experts, both in science and economics. We have fun, and I'm going to share a little fun in a minute. Pictures are better than words. I've got some of those coming up. And Citizens Climate Lobby's Carbon Fee and Dividend one-page laser talk and 2-minute intro video are amazing. And you can use them to learn and share them to spread the word. Equity is really important in climate solutions. We understand the importance of political will and help citizens create it by sharing resources, actions, encouraging next steps, and following up. And we take a bipartisan approach because when you want to make a fundamental change in the US economy as big as this, you want it to stick, and you need people from both parties to support it. Gregory Mankiw is a professor of economics at Harvard, one of the thousands of economists that have signed on to the Economist Statement. And he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bush, says, the closest thing I know to a panacea in the climate change debate is putting a price on carbon and rebating the revenue to citizens. Okay, time for a little fun. Here's a 2-minute video, Carbon Pricing Explained with Chickens.
This is Sally. She's like most chickens her age. She'll grow up in a place like this. And that means Sally's hiding something.
A carbon footprint. Sally's farm used electricity from a coal-fired power plant. Her farmer drives a diesel pickup, and her feed comes from a factory that consumes its own electricity and fuel. Now, meet Colin. Colin was raised on a solar-powered farm, eating locally sourced feed. Today, raising Colin is more expensive than raising Sally, because carbon-free energy is currently more expensive than fossil fuels. But someday soon, Sally's carbon footprint could tip the scales. Why? If we want to keep a livable climate, we have to put way less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You've got two basic options. You could make a law that limits how much fossil fuels a person or company can burn, penalize them if they break the law. Sort of like a speeding ticket. Laws like that aren't always popular, though. That's where the second option comes in, putting a price on carbon emissions. Right now, you can put as much carbon dioxide into the air as you like, without paying a dime. But what if people had to pay? Almost 20 countries around the world have adopted a carbon tax. Here's how it works. Companies pay a tax when they buy fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. The price is based on how much carbon is in the fuel. And then they try to pass those costs on to customers. That means with a carbon tax, the cost of raising Sally goes up. And ultimately, when it's time for Sally to go to the great chicken afterlife, it should be easier for consumers to pick Colin for dinner.
So this video is about 8 years old. It said 20 countries are pricing carbon. Of course, it's now 76 countries and regions. So a little fun thing to share to help people understand how carbon pricing works to reduce emissions throughout the whole economy. Here's a picture of how to explain carbon fee and dividend. A steadily rising carbon fee charged at the source, coal mines, oil refineries, ports of entry, steadily rising. The money goes into a carbon trust and is rebated back to households by the Treasury each month in equal per capita shares back to all households. There's no means testing. Adults get 1 share per adult, and it's a half a share per child. And then there's the border carbon adjustments to charge our carbon price on the imports of free polluting countries and rebate our exporters so that U.S. producers have a level playing field both in the U.S. and overseas. Okay, there's also that's a 2-minute video. It's a CCL introduction that explains carbon fee and dividend and creating political will again. You can get to the slideshow and play it later in the interest of time. I'll go on to the household impact study. This is a microeconomic study commissioned by CCL on the impacts to various demographics of the first year carbon fee and dividend. It's a $15 per ton carbon fee on fossil fuel production. They divided households into quintiles, so they're 20% buckets by consumption. So that's a good proxy for income. So basically the lowest 20% of households by income is represented by this first section. The dark blue is direct energy cost increases, and the light blue indirect energy cost increases, the trickle-down effect of the carbon fee paid by coal, oil, and gas producers. So the total for the bottom 20% of households would add up to about $273 for a family of 4. But everybody gets the same amount back, which is about $514 for a family of 4. Now, the higher income families are paying income tax on that money, so it looks like their after-tax income amount does decline, but everybody gets the same back. And so this is another gap, but this is a good gap. The gap between what the total increase in their costs from the trickle-down effects of the carbon fee and the money that they get each month. This is positive money they don't have right now. So 2/3 of all families break even or come out ahead with this policy. And it's good for families and it's good for businesses. This is a report from the Climate Leadership Council showing the energy intensity of production in different countries. The US is a clean producer, uh, and the EU is also clean, but most of our other trading partners produce far more carbon emissions per unit of good than the US. So here's China. China, economy-wide, is 3.6 times more carbon intensive than the US. This basically means that on average, goods imported from China will pay a carbon border import tariff that's 3.6 times more than the higher costs that US producers are paying due to the trickle-down effects of the carbon fee in the US economy. So this makes US producers more competitive in the US marketplace. And it strongly motivates these other countries to match our carbon price. So this is how we can use our economic might to push our carbon price around the world. Here again is that economist statement. This is the full thing this time. It has 5 short statements, but it basically says this is a serious problem. It's due to a market failure, the failure of the market to account for the costs of climate pollution and the price of fossil fuels. Um, the most cost-effective way to address that is a steadily rising carbon fee on the production and imports of fossil fuels. The most equitable thing to do with that money is to rebate it to U.S. citizens through equal lump sum payments, and then use a border carbon adjustment to protect U.S. producers in our economy and hold free producing polluting countries accountable for their pollution and motivate them to price carbon as we need them to do for our safety. Here is Gregory Mankiw again about the importance of political will.
So is it possible to ever pass a carbon tax now, given the current political situation? I mean, half the people in office still don't believe in climate change. Yes, we can. During the campaign, President Obama didn't want to say the word carbon tax because it polled terribly. We want to change president's view of carbon taxes. We need to change the public's view of carbon taxes. Think of gay marriage. Remember, Barack Obama ran against gay marriage.
I am not a supporter of gay marriage.
When did he switch? When the polls started switching.
I think same-sex couples should be able to get married.
Politicians, whether we call them our elected leaders, are really our elected followers. They do what the people want them to do. We need to preach to the American people. Once the American people are convinced, the politicians will fall in line very quickly.
And it wasn't just Obama that had a political will problem. President Biden had a similar problem. Citizens Climate Lobby lobbied him for 10 years for carbon fee and dividend legislation. But when he was elected with climate as a top level issue and carbon pricing was required to achieve his climate goals that he set for the country, he didn't even publicly mention carbon fee and dividend during his presidency. So we need more political will to enable the leader the next time there's an opportunity to do this, to have the political courage to do it. So use good messaging. It shouldn't be free to pollute, and you get more money back. A CBAM pushes it around the world, and carbon fee and dividend gets us halfway to our global 1.5 degrees goal. Talk about carbon fee and dividend in every climate discussion you have with friends, family, groups, influencers, and legislators. Have you ever heard of carbon cashback? Or have you ever heard of cashback carbon pricing? And you can share actions and resources that help tell Congress we want this, and resources to help learn how to talk about it and share. cclusa.org/write-cfd is an easy way to write an email to Congress, and bit.ly/CFD resources is a Google Drive with a lot of files that you can print or share via email. And we need to find common ground with everybody to bridge the partisan divide to make this possible. Keep learning from experts. James Hansen, Jonathan Marshall, and Danny Richter. There's a training coming up on May 22nd about the Foreign Polluters Fee Act. This is basically an import tariff, carbon import tariff bill sponsored by Republicans. And so we're going to be lobbying about that this summer at CCL's summer conference. The links to these reports are all available in the notes of this slideshow. There's conservative support for this policy from George Schultz, who wrote an article called The Winning Conservative Climate Solution, and he talks about carbon fee and dividend as being it. The Conservative Case for Climate Action. Libertarian thought leader Jerry Taylor has a YouTube video. He gave a talk at Widener University where he concludes carbon fee and dividend is the best approach. Even Rex Tillerson, when he was CEO of Exxon, there's a video of him expounding the benefits of a carbon fee and dividend over the Waxman-Markey bill. He suggested calling it a refundable greenhouse gas emissions fee. And then Elon Musk retweeted a video last year that he narrates, an 8-minute climate video, in which he says the only action needed to solve climate change is a carbon tax with a cashback household rebate. It's economics 101. He's not quite right about the only thing, but it's great to have conservative voices favoring this. The IPCC says the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about a collective action movement for a couple minutes. We've done them in the past in the US. There's one right now that's just getting off the ground. It's a collective action movement to build support for carbon fee and dividend on campuses around the country. This is also a project high schools and even middle school students might want to do. It consists of posters and stickers. And then when interest among the student body is raised, events to talk about what the policy is and encourage people to write Congress, as the sign recommends. You can learn about this at cfdmovement.org and send students you know to check it out if they're worried about climate change. This is a fun, easy project for them to take, and it will teach them fundamental economics about climate change and help them advocate for the most effective climate policy. And you can table at your alma mater and contact a college near you or a high school near you to help engage them. You can stand up at these democracy rallies that are starting to happen. Talk about the billionaires who have misled about climate pollution for decades. They don't want it to be addressed. They're taking over our government to delay that indefinitely. Talk about carbon fee and dividend. It shouldn't be free to pollute. You get more money back. You can ask the crowd, do you think it should be free to pollute? And I bet they'll say no. Okay, so policy-focused climate action is what we need. We got climate action focus in the 2020 election, and Biden got elected to do climate action, but we didn't get carbon fee and dividend. So these are all things that can be done to help create the political will to enable our elected leaders to do what we need them to do. Inspire, recruit, and empower others. You can go to carboncashback.org to see a project that you can do in your town. Collect signatures to put on a citizens petition warrant article on your town's next warrant, where your town voters can decide if they want to ask Congress to take action on climate pollution. We've had good luck. 75% of the towns that have done this have passed it. We could update some of the policy from CCL's original carbon fee and dividend, higher prices. We don't rebate fossil fuel exporters. We want to rebate all of our producers, except those that produce fossil fuels. If we don't rebate the carbon fee at the border when they export fossil fuels, that won't make too much difference in the global price of fossil fuels, but it will raise a lot of money that could be used to fund other ways to make this policy more viable. Miles driven rebate and a whole bunch of other things. And the head of the World Trade Organization says we should revoke the permission of the fossil fuel industry to advertise, similar to what we did for big tobacco. We could do that to the fossil fuel industry. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for spending the time here to learn how you can help create the political will to close the growing US carbon price gap. And I scheduled an hour, but I'll stick around if anybody has questions. I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
John, I have two quick questions.
Yes.
So when you were talking about Canada and them stepping back, you mentioned a couple of things. You said that on their gas pumps, they put how much more gas was costing. Do you know what that approximately what that number was?
Well, it was growing, I think, was the main concern recently. It wasn't that much. They got up to about, what I think there's $70 per ton of CO2 now, which would put about 70 cents per increase per gallon of gas. They sell it in liters. Don't ask me to do the calculation.
Yeah,
Divide by
that's
four,
fine.
I
But
guess.
yeah, but
Um,
yeah, so that would, I can understand why that would, if you put 70 cents a gallon on a US pump,
yeah.
people would go crazy.
Yeah, but actually, the signs weren't there when it was this high. That was several years ago, when the policy first came out. So it was, it started at $20 Canadian and it was rising $10 a year when they were doing that. So it would have been more like 20 or 30 cents per gallon. But I think any additional price and blaming it on the carbon fee was just bad press. You're right, 70 cents more per gallon of gas. This would take 6 years to get that high with a carbon fee and dividend policy. But remember, most families are coming out ahead. And
Yeah, no, I understand that.
if
I
you
understand the propaganda involved.
yeah, but if
I
you've
have another,
got
yeah,
that high of a carbon price, you're coming out much farther ahead than you are the first year. So, but it's clear that we need to communicate that people are coming out ahead when we get carbon fee and dividend legislated. There needs to be part of the bill has to be paying for education of the public so that people
absolutely.
can't be turned sour. Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
Let's see, Susan.
Yeah, Susan.
So a comment and a question. Comment, I think it was just last year that the legislature wanted, or somewhere in the state house, they wanted to have that, maybe just on utility bills somewhere that saying, this is how much your renewable funds are costing you. Just trying
Yeah,
to,
it's a standard ploy recommended by ALEC uh, for states in the US to make it seem highlight the bad. You know, it's basically not telling the whole truth, but telling what's going on, cherry picking parts of it that they think will sour people on the policies. They're very very effective at doing it. And, the question in our state is why do we have state legislators going to these front group conferences and coming back with these bills from ALEC to do these things? It's disappointing. They're, they they should know by now what these groups are all about. We've been telling them for years now that they're being tricked by front groups that are being funded by the fossil fuel industry. But I think we just need to raise the public's awareness so that there's some shame involved in the legislators that continue to act as if what they're doing is following conservative values. They're not. They're following the fossil fuel industry billionaire profit policies.
well, the whole free state issue, these legislators are not doing what their townspeople want them to do, but it has been made clear to them that if they don't follow the rules set by the Free State movement, they will be primaried. So the fear factor is greater than the conscience factor.
Yeah, there's some news organizations, NH Bulletin and In-Depth New Hampshire, that are starting to call this out more.
Right.
There's Granite Matters Facebook group that is fighting the billionaires and the free staters. Um, there's 1.3 million people in New Hampshire, and mainstream media isn't covering this. I think it's a matter of educating the public, and so we can help by writing letters to the editor and encouraging the media to cover this more. It really is important.
And Kent Street is getting much more active with it, so
Mhm.
maybe you'll hear about it more. And then I have a question, which I might have missed. Sorry, I got here late. Is the CBM, is that kind of riding the coattails of all of these crazy tariffs, or you taking a rest on the idea about a CBM now, or?
It's a very good question. There's almost nothing in common with Trump's across the board indiscriminate tariffs, which basically I think he's doing because it opens a door for grift. He can make private deals with companies and countries and give them a deal. There's no economic basis for these tariffs. It's extortion, and it's hurting American households. It will start to hurt more and more over the next couple of weeks as the drop in shipping starts to affect what was on the store's shelves and the prices of things. No, so the carbon border adjustment is a price applied at the border, but it is based. It's WTO compliant. It's if you have a price on pollution in your own economy, because we're charging fossil fuel producers a polluter's fee. Um, our producers are seeing that cost in the energy that they're buying. Now, this will motivate them to get solar panels and use clean energy, but it will for 2 decades or so, the cost of energy, average cost of energy in the US will rise from this carbon fee. Then it drops below where it is now and continues to drop until it's about half of what it is now by the end of the century, the total energy spend because clean energy will be cheaper when it's produced in mass quantities. But we have to get over this 2 decade hump. Um, so we have rising energy costs in the US because we have a polluter's fee on it. We can charge our fee on imports to level that pollution price from other countries. So if a country matches our price, then there's no fee. Their goods just come right across the border. If one is half our price, we charge the other half. If there's a free polluting country, we charge our whole fee at the border. That report from the Climate Leadership Council determines the embedded carbon emissions, the carbon footprint of all those different goods. And we need the Department of Energy to do the calculation for the official numbers. But they have to do that anyway, because we're going to start paying the EU and other countries their carbon price. So we want official government, US government figures on our carbon levels. And we'll probably need to do China and other countries as well, so we can help the EU hold China accountable for its actual carbon emissions. But this is WTO compliant. Households are coming out ahead. Remember, even with the border carbon adjustment, most families are coming out ahead financially each month. That's very different than Trump's carbon tariff, which that money is going to go to pay for some of the tax cuts for the billionaires. Not nearly all of it, but he's basically making things. He's charging a sales tax on Americans, and he's using that money to cut taxes for the billionaires. So that's a little different than families coming ahead. Yeah. Reinhard, was that did that answer
Yeah.
your question, Susan?
Does that answer your question, Susan?
Well, one little bit there, there had been a bill to let people know how our industry compares to other countries, and I think that was, you showed us that graph. Did that
Yeah.
bill pass or
No, that's the Prove It
no?
Act.
Prove It Act.
It's still active. It's a bipartisan bill. It went through the Senate committees. It'll probably get rolled up into this foreign polluters fee bill that is active right now. They'll need to do these calculations. There's just different legislative pathways to require the Department of Energy to do it. But it's a very hot idea right now I think maybe even Trump will be interested in this Foreign Polluters Fee Act because it's another tariff, and I don't think he'll care where it's coming from. It's not specific, it's not probably WTO compliant because it sets the level of US emissions as the zero mark. It's not based on a carbon price, but if countries pollute more than the US amount, then they pay that. So it's kind of cheating, but it's exciting that Republicans are talking about uh, carbon pricing and the competitive advantage that the price of carbon gives US producers. And it is, so it's a good talking, it's a good thing to have people talking about.
It's interesting. I think that's also very dangerous, though, because it's not fair and it's not WTO compliant. So it's there's a real risk of a backlash on that. I think that's quite a risky approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's tariffs are getting a bad name as it is right now.
Yeah.
I agree. A pure carbon fee and dividend bill with a CBAM is the right way to do this. The question is, without the political will for it, how do we create the political will? You know,
Yeah.
we actually don't have any control over whether Congress does this. It's Senators Kramer and Graham who have introduced this. You know, we have been lobbying them to do it as part of carbon fee and dividend. There's other Republicans that don't want to talk about carbon pricing, but they want to take advantage of the competitive advantage piece of it.
Mhm.
You know, I don't, we won't
Yeah.
be lobbying against it. In July, when we go down as volunteers to Washington, we'll get trained on what CCL's position is, which is usually a pretty nuanced position. You know, we won't come out fully in favor of it unless it's, you know, doesn't have some trapdoors in it.
Because it will raise prices, obviously, like a lot of tariffs. It'll do that, and it won't there won't be any any cashback
Yeah,
involved.
exactly. Nothing compared to what Trump's tariffs are doing to prices, because
Yeah.
I assume they would start at a low price and increase it over time. But yeah.
Right. Anyway, so I was listening, trying to, put myself in the position of someone who's not at all familiar with these things. So I took some notes. I can talk to you later about some of those impressions. But I did have one question, which was, I think it would be really useful if you had an estimate. And I think you basically just said now that there isn't a good estimate, but how much that we're actually exporting um, to other countries that would be covered by a carbon by a CBAM,
Mm,
and how much we're importing from them. I think if you had some kind of a quantity, because most people are not aware of that except for China, people
yeah.
know our relationship with China, but not with the EU or the UK or Australia or anything like that. So you
That's a
mentioned those countries, but it's like a blank for most people as to how much that
yeah.
actually means.
It's a really good point. I did talk to some steel producers who so carbon fee and dividend over 10 years would increase U.S. steel production by 50%. But most of that would be just sold within the U.S. Turns out we really don't export steel to the EU, and
Yeah.
unless the price was really high, we probably won't. So, you know, part of the benefit of this, you know, the EU imports a lot of steel from China. When they announced a couple of years ago that there were going to be two phases to their CBAM, China started looking at adding steel into their uh, carbon market. They have a carbon price in their industry. It's a cap and trade with a pretty low price. But they, you know, probably have plans to continue increasing that. And they started looking at adding steel to it because they know it's important to decarbonize their steel industry. Carbon pricing is a cost-effective way to do that. And if they charge a carbon price on steel on emissions from steel production, then they don't have to pay the EU on it. So, you know, basically the idea is um, have enough countries with a significant carbon price join into a kind of a carbon club, charging the free polluting countries. And if you take EU, Japan, UK, Canada, and the US, that's about half of the global market. So if all of us had a good carbon price and a CBAM, the rest of the other half of the world um, honestly would be happy to price carbon. You know, most of them are
Mhm.
just waiting for the US. That I didn't really introduce the waiting for Godot slide properly, but they are waiting for us to price carbon and put a CBM in place. And then countries that would like to do this, but they can't. They're, you know, for their voters wouldn't like it, or they
Mhm.
don't want to lose the competitive, you know, position of free
You know
pollution.
that the metaphor of a climate club, I think, is also really useful. In fact, that was one of the notes that I took. because people are very familiar with that idea. You know, if there is a club and there are benefits to being a member of it, then other countries want to be with it too. And that's like even a more fundamental approach to the climate problem. I mean, it's the approach because
Hmm.
that's the only way to get many countries involved is to have some benefit that you're offering if they'll join, which means they have to pay a certain, you know, fee essentially, right?
Well,
Which is
they charge their own
set a
carbon
price.
price, and then they don't
Yeah, I
have to
mean,
pay it.
it's a
Yeah.
fee of just they have to be involved
Yes.
in that way in order to join this club, and by joining the club they get some benefits or they escape some deficits.
Yeah.
So
Well, it keeps them competitive because carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way to decarbonize your economy. And as more and more countries start charging their carbon price on in trade, the countries that aren't working to decarbonize now are going to become less and less competitive over time. So it there's a whole bunch of complementary things that work really well,
yeah,
yeah, with the carbon club.
yeah, so that's something that you could actually include as a
Mm.
sort of upfront in the presentation. You could talk about that. How do we create this club, and why do we want to be a member of it, and that kind of thing.
That's great. Right after the carbon pricing is spreading, prices are rising, and CBMs are coming. I need a carbon club slide that shows
Yeah,
why we want to be a part of this, not left outside and delaying it. And that sets
right,
up the waiting for Godot thing, because really we're waiting for the US, the world is waiting for the US to join the carbon club, and that's gonna
right.
tip the scale.
Yeah, we don't want to be outside pressing our nose against the glass and the window and not being able to get in, that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
Well, their prices are rising. Yeah. And the longer we take to join, the longer the other half of the world that is waiting for us to join will take to price carbon. And that's bad for us. That's a lot of climate pollution that we're going to suffer from.